when he was freed, he became president. His presidency ended, and he was still on the terror list in the United States. It was after, I think 3 years after he retired, that his name and the name of the ANC was finally removed from the uh, terror list in the United States, which is itself pretty uh, extraordinary. But near the end, the apartheid regime became uh, a pariah regime in the eyes of the world. Even the West could no longer preserve its image. And I think that's more or less what led it to collapse. I think what is going to ultimately bring about an end to the Israeli regime is not some sudden attack or anything like that. I think that the regime itself is gradually going to decline, especially since the West is declining and the power behind the regime is declining in relative terms. And so I think that it will ultimately, there will be a lot of violence, there will be a lot of bloodshed, but I think that these are the facts that will ultimately be key to its demise. I don't think a military conflict is probable. I don't think it's very likely. I think it's unlikely. I don't think it's impossible. It could happen, but I think that if we look at it logically, those who understand Iran to a degree in the Pentagon, they know that they cannot win and that it would lead to the destruction of the global economy, and it would end Trump's presidency and it would end US power. It would be devastating for everyone, including Iran, but that would be war. I think Iran has established a balance of terror of sorts in this regard because so much oil and gas is literally right in front of Iran. The Persian Gulf is not very wide, and it's Iran owns half of it. That's why it's called the Persian Gulf. So if there's conflict, there's no way that the Americans, I mean, if the Americans can't get, if over the last year and a half under Biden, they couldn't get Israeli ships to get through the Red Sea, how are they going to get all these thousands of ships and tankers in and out of the Persian Gulf? It's just not going to happen when there's Iran there. So I think they recognize that. And so I think it's highly unlikely. It's not impossible because Trump is Trump. And, one day you think that he's going to really solve the problems with Russia and hopefully bring about an end to this slaughter. And then the next day he gives this ridiculous 30-day ceasefire proposal. And then the next day you have something. You never really know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so it's literally impossible for me at least, to predict, but I think it's highly unlikely that there will be war. Iran's only weak point is the economy. And the Americans, I'm sure they will be trying to undermine Iran through terrorism, through creating unrest, and that sort of thing. And we'll probably see elements of that in the months ahead. But I have no doubt that the Iranians will not have any serious problems uh, with stability. Uh, I think ultimately the only way that the United States is going to get a deal with Iran is for the United States to change its mentality. Trump was the one who tore the nuclear deal. He tore it up, and so there's no incentive for the Iranians to negotiate with him. Right now, he's attacking Iran, abusing Iran, threatening Iran. That's not going to lead to negotiations. It's going to do the opposite. And then he has a history, and so does the United States, of violating deals, whether it's the Minsk Accords or the uh, treaties with the Russians or the Soviet Union over nuclear missiles. The Americans just, or advancing NATO eastwards, they've been violating all their agreements. And so Iran has to, if it wants to negotiate with Trump, it has to believe that you can trust him to carry out his obligations. Uh, Even to enemies, in order for them to negotiate, there has to be this minimal trust. If you have no trust, then there can be no negotiations because it just won't work. It doesn't mean trust that you like the other side, but trust, a certain amount of trust that if he says he will do something, that he will actually carry that out. He will abide by those obligations. And the Iranians don't see that in the United States. They don't see that in Trump. So at the moment, I do not see any chance of any negotiations within the United States. Messages will go back and forth as they always do, but negotiations, I don't see that happening anytime soon. And I think that time is not on the side of the United States. They are in competition with China, but the Americans are at war with everyone. And the Chinese are carrying on with business as usual under very difficult circumstances, the global, tariffs and war and global upheaval and the declining global economy. But still, at least they're not paying for 850 military bases across the world, and they're not paying for wars, and they're not destroying their image across the global South and among the global majority. So while the United States is still paying for the war in Ukraine in different ways, I'm not saying just direct payment, but also the very fact that there are sanctions and there's conflict, it's costly. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, according to Trump himself, costed the United States $8 trillion. That $8 trillion wasn't just about weapons. It was about everything. It was the cost for the United States, direct and indirect. And I think the cost of the Ukraine war will continue to increase until it ultimately comes to an end and sanctions are removed and the relationship is normalized. And I think the cost for the Ukrainian war, if the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were $8 billion or $1 trillion, sorry, and of course the dirty war in Syria, which is another story in itself, then the war in Ukraine was definitely more than all of those combined. You have 2,000 kilometers of front lines. You have gas and oil, uh, you know, cut from a continent or the European Union. The and even the decline of Europe is not really good for the U.S. economy. I mean, some people say that some of the businesses are traveling to the United States. True, the United States does benefit. They're selling very expensive gas to Europe. However, if you are going to be the global hegemon, you want somewhat strong and loyal lieutenants. But if your lieutenants are all weak and broken, then that's not good for you either in the broader sense. So I think that the United States, the more we move forward, relatively speaking, the position of Iran gets stronger and the position of the United States gets weaker. So I think Trump needs a deal with Iran sooner rather than later, just as he needs a deal with Russia sooner rather than later. But I don't see that happening because he's carrying out genocide in Gaza, he's behaving genocidal in Yemen, and the language that he uses when speaking with Iran and the threats that he makes don't intimidate the Iranian government.